Reverse Psychology, 13 Lessons on How to Use Rejection to Your Advantage. Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius. It was supposed to be just another ordinary night, but what echoes is the silence. A silence that weighs, that fills every corner where there was once some presence. It's not the silence of someone sleeping. It's the silence of someone who was left, ignored, forgotten. That kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, it brings absence. Have you ever felt that? When a notification doesn't arrive, when a gaze shifts away, when your words slip through a conversation as if they were invisible. Rejection doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply doesn't respond. And what remains is you, trying to understand what you did wrong. Rejection hurts, not just because of what's missing, but because of what it reveals about us. Because when someone leaves us, something inside us screams for an explanation, but it almost never comes. And that's where the danger arises, thinking the problem lies in who we are, instead of understanding what we're trying to prove. There's a subtle, almost imperceptible, but very common mistake, believing that being loved depends on the other, that we only fully exist when the other person chooses us, responds to us, validates us. However, this dependence, silent and persistent, undermines our internal clarity and distances us from ourselves. There's a form of rejection that doesn't come with harsh words, but with small gestures that deny affection, not replying to messages, shifting one's gaze, not considering feelings. These are almost invisible attitudes, but they carry the weight of 1,000 explicit refusals. And the worst part is that often we accept this as normal. Seneca wrote, with the lucidity of one who had lost much, that what abandons us often returns us to ourselves. And this is the paradoxical wound of rejection. It tears us away from someone, but if faced with courage, it can return us to who we truly are. Marcus Aurelius, another who knew what it was like to be left even in power, reminds us that what we feel is not inevitable. What we feel is, in part, what we choose to think about what happens to us, and that changes everything. So, perhaps the silence of rejection is not just an echo of abandonment. Perhaps it is a calling, a whisper that pushes us inward, to fearlessly look at what made us beg for the presence of others, to understand where this urgency to be accepted came from. That's where the opening begins. Not for the other, but for oneself. An introspective opening, where rejection transforms into a mirror, and what we see in it is a way back, not to the past, nor to those who left, but to what, within us, was waiting to be seen all along. When silence says, "You are not needed," it wasn't a fight, nor a definitive goodbye. It was just silence, that dense silence that settles in when the other person is still present, but no longer truly there, when their eyes pass over you as if you were glass, when good morning turns into a monosyllable, when physical presence insists on pretending not to see emotional absence. Few pains are as persistent as this. Realizing, day after day, that you are no longer a priority, that you are physically there, but you no longer matter. It doesn't matter if you're tired, if you're sad, if you need to be heard. What you feel seems to have lost the right to exist in the space between you, and this slowly corrodes you. Some say it's independence, that everyone needs their space, but there's a fine line between autonomy and emotional detachment. When the other person closes themselves off internally, and you still insist on offering shelter, it's like talking to a door locked from the inside. And this creates an absence that no one comments on, but that both feel. This form of rejection doesn't shout, but it subtly kills your worth, because being ignored without reason by someone you're still trying to reach steals your sense of deservingness. You start to doubt your own value, not because you did something wrong, but because you were treated as invisible. And this type of pain leaves no visible mark. No one sees it, no one comments on it, but you feel it in your body, in your withdrawn gestures, in the way you start to speak more softly, as if even your own voice didn't deserve to be heard, as if you needed to apologize for existing. The other's silence begins to echo within you, as if it were your own. And that's where the danger lies. When you start treating yourself as you are treated, when you adopt the same indifference that hurt you, but against yourself. When you start to believe that not being needed is synonymous with having no worth, but it's not. It never was. The other's absence does not define your presence in the world, and the silence you were made to swallow doesn't have to remain your native language. You can still relearn to talk to yourself, to listen to what hurts, and remember that your importance doesn't disappear just because someone stopped seeing it. The mistake of trying to be indispensable to someone who doesn't see. There's an invisible thirst that many people carry, a hunger to be seen, recognized, chosen, not out of vanity, but for emotional survival. Because at some point in life, we learned that we only have value when we are useful, when we serve, when we help, when we save, and so we mold ourselves ourselves, doing more than we can, giving more than we should, saying yes even when our whole body screams no, in the silent hope that perhaps the other person will notice, that perhaps we will begin to matter. But there's something cruel about this pattern, because the more you try to make yourself indispensable, the easier it is to be discarded. The more you do, the more it's expected that you continue doing. The more you give of yourself, the more the other seems to believe it's your obligation and not a choice. Seneca wrote, "Whoever offers everything loses everything." And this is one of the hardest pains to swallow, realizing that by trying to be everything to someone, you ended up being nothing to yourself. That, by offering yourself entirely, the other received you with indifference, or didn't even notice you were there. There's a subtle trap in this constant effort to please. It distances us from who we are, because we start living according to the other's reaction, measuring our worth by the reflection in someone else's eyes. And when that gaze doesn't come, or comes empty, something inside us fades. It's not wrong to want to be important. The problem is trying to be essential to someone who doesn't even see you, to someone who only sees what you do, not what you feel, to someone who consumes your presence, but doesn't reciprocate with any presence. And then, we need to face a truth that hurts, but liberates. Your worth isn't in how much someone needs you, it's in how much you can be true to what you feel, even if that means leaving a place where you only exist as a function. It's a difficult choice, but sometimes you have to stop being useful to finally be whole. Rejection is not a sentence. It's a sign of a path breaking. There's a question that almost always appears after we've been left. Why wasn't I enough? It comes as a whisper, sometimes as a scream, but always loaded with guilt, as if rejection were a certificate of personal failure, as if the pain of being left confirmed that there's something wrong with who we were. But that question is a trap, because it stems from a cruel premise, that the other's love is proof of our validity, and that's not true. What ends is not always because it was bad. What hurts is not always because something was lacking in you. Sometimes it's just life saying, this path is over. Now it's another one. Rejection hurts, but it also signals. It points to where there's no more space, where you're trying to plant in dry soil, where everything you do comes back in the form of silence. It's hard to see this when your heart is still bleeding, but with time, if we listen carefully, the pain begins to speak another language. Marcus Aurelius used to say that, if pain is inevitable, resistance to it is optional. And perhaps that's the key. The pain of rejection comes. It will keep coming, but what we do with it is a choice. That's where our freedom lies, in how we interpret abandonment, in the meaning we give to absence. There's something almost mystical in realizing this. When someone leaves, something always comes back. Sometimes it's your autonomy. Sometimes it's the silence you needed to hear yourself. Sometimes it's that part of you that you had forgotten from trying so hard to please the other. The end of an external presence can be the beginning of an internal reconnection. So no, rejection is not a sentence. It's not an end. It's just a bend in the road, a detour that forces you to rethink your steps. And perhaps it's precisely in that detour that you finally find a piece of yourself that should never have been left behind. 4. The Stoic exercise of not getting lost in abandonment. Some rejections don't come with words. They come with absence, with messages that don't arrive, promises that evaporate, eyes that once sought yours and now look past you, as if you've become part of the furniture. And in these moments, the greatest danger isn't being left. It's getting lost in the abandonment, because there's a type of emotional disorientation that arises when we're left without explanation. The head spins in circles, trying to understand. The chest tightens, as if the air has changed density, and without realizing it, we dissolve in the attempt to understand what went wrong. But there's a silent, deeply stoic exercise that can keep us anchored, reconstructing in silence, making abandonment a starting point, not an end point, not with anger, not with haste, but with presence, with awareness of what still remains within us, even after everything that has gone. It's in the night journal that this reconstruction begins. It doesn't have to be beautiful, nor coherent. It just has to be honest, just right. Today, I wasn't chosen, and yet I am here. Because this simple act of registering pain without escape, without disguise, without performance, is already a gesture of reconnection with who we are inside. And perhaps you'll realize in this process that you've already overcome things you swore you couldn't bear, that you've stood up after much worse losses, that you've survived crueler silences. And remembering that is remembering yourself, what you are capable of, even when no one is looking. Stoic virtue isn't about appearing strong. It's about maintaining dignity, even when everything crumbles. It's choosing to remain whole, even when the world tries to reduce you to pieces, because abandonment can take a lot, but it cannot touch your integrity unless you surrender it. And you don't have to surrender. You can retreat. breathe, write, listen to what still pulses. And remember, being left does not define who you are. What you do with it does. And sometimes, the silence that remains is the exact space where your soul can fit again. 5. A cruel metaphor about giving everything and receiving crumbs. Have you ever built a house in someone's heart? Have you placed your fears, your affections, your most silent vulnerabilities there, and waited to be embraced? Have you done everything you could, not out of obligation, but out of love, and yet you were never truly invited in? There's a type of rejection that doesn't happen during a breakup. It happens in continuity, when you offer everything, but receive crumbs, when you give yourself entirely, but are kept on the sidelines, when your every gesture of care meets emptiness as a response, and yet you persist, because you think, perhaps, the next gesture will be enough. But there's a phrase that needs to echo, even if it hurts. It's not that I gave too much. It's that I gave myself to someone who doesn't know how to receive. And this is an almost invisible pain, because it doesn't come from a clear no. It comes from an almost, from a maybe, from a you're special. But the Stoic doesn't offer expecting return. They offer out of virtue, out of choice, out of integrity, because they know that neediness cannot be the reason for care. And yet, they feel, they bleed, they suffer, but they choose not to get lost in that suffering. The house you build in someone else's heart needs first to have foundations within you. Otherwise, every refusal will be an earthquake, every silence, a crack, every detachment, a collapse. And you cannot keep crumbling just because the other doesn't know how to sustain what you are. There's a very common illusion that every emotional effort will be rewarded with reciprocity. But the reality is that sometimes the other person doesn't even have the internal space to receive what you offer. And that's not your fault. It's not about you not being good enough. It's about the other person not being ready or willing to make space. So there comes a point where you need to stop, not out of resentment, but out of self-love, because continuing to insist on someone who keeps you on the outside is to repeat the abandonment you fear so much, and you no longer need that. You've already learned that there's a place where love truly begins, and it begins within, where no one can cast you out. The raw beauty of being rejected and not disappearing. Not all pain needs to be overcome. Some simply need to be felt until they transform into understanding. Rejection is one such pain. It doesn't announce its arrival, and it almost never asks for permission, but once it enters, it leaves traces everywhere, in gestures, in thoughts, in the silences we choose to keep. The biggest trap of rejection is believing that it diminishes us, that because someone left, something essential in us was taken away. But the hardest and most liberating truth is that no one can steal us from ourselves unless we allow it, unless we abandon ourselves along with them. Seneca said, "Whoever depends on others to be whole will always live in pieces." And perhaps this is the hidden lesson behind every no we receive. The need to return to oneself, to patiently rebuild the pieces that were left in the wrong hands, to remember that our wholeness was never in the gaze of others. Marcus Aurelius wrote about the duty not to abandon oneself, even when everyone else leaves. This requires courage, not the courage to face the world, but the courage to remain with oneself when everything feels empty. The courage to look in your own mirror and say, I am still here. Rejection, when navigated with lucidity, ceases to be about who left, and it becomes about what we need to rediscover within, about which parts of ourselves were forgotten in the effort to please, about the silence we learned to listen to when there was no one else to answer. And then one day, without warning, something sprouts. Amidst the stones, amidst what seemed barren, a small flower, silent, firm, intact. And you realize that even rejected, you didn't disappear. On the contrary, you finally began to truly exist. Now, breathe. Don't rush this last sensation. Let it settle. Let it echo. Because perhaps in that final silence, you will begin to hear yourself in a new way. And that, in itself, is a new beginning.